Imagine spending your whole life caring for someone, and one day receiving the connection that changes everything. Don't come home. I've already rented out your room and donated your things. This is what happened to an elderly mother who dedicated every second of her life to her son. And from now on, you will hear this story from her own voice. Get ready, because nothing you imagine comes close to what really happened.
I was at home, in the middle of an ordinary morning, when the phone rang. The sound sounded like any other, but it carried an omen I couldn't interpret at the time. I calmly picked up the phone, never imagining that my life would change in seconds. On the other end, my son's voice, cold and unhesitating, uttered words that cut through my chest. "Don't come home." The moment I heard that sentence, my hands lost their strength. It was as if the phone had turned to lead. I leaned against the table to keep from falling. I thought I'd misheard, that it was a joke, a passing misunderstanding. But then he repeated it, even more harshly, adding, "I've already rented your room and donated your things." It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under me. His words echoed in my mind like hammers. It wasn't just about objects or a physical space. It was about me, about my existence within that house. It was as if, suddenly, I had ceased to be a part of his life. The silence that followed was even more cruel because it contained all the questions I couldn't ask. I remembered the coffee that had been on the stove, now boiling on its own, as if it didn't matter. The kettle whistled, but I couldn't hear it clearly. Everything seemed distant. The world around me remained the same, but inside me, everything had shattered. Life, which until then had a familiar rhythm, was interrupted by a phrase I can't forget. I wanted to answer, wanted to ask why, but the word stuck. It was as if my throat had been closed by an invisible hand. The pain was so great that speaking would have been impossible. And deep down, maybe I didn't want to hear the answer, because there are things that, when spoken, hurt even more than silence. As he continued speaking, my mind filled with images from the past. I saw him small, begging to be held, crying for fear of the dark, hugging me tightly. How could the same voice that once called me Mommy now tell me not to go back? This contradiction tore me apart because it showed how life can turn upside down without warning. When the connection ended, I held the phone to my ear, listening to nothing. It was as if it could still summon a shred of voice that might bring comfort, but there was nothing but silence. The sound of the kettle brought me back to reality. I turned off the burner, but the smell of coffee was no longer welcoming. It was the smell of loss, of an unplanned goodbye. I sat at the table, my hands still shaking. I ran my fingers over the wood, as if I could find steadiness in the object that had always supported me in the mornings. But even the table felt different, as if it had witnessed an intimate tragedy. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just the phone that had rung. It was life itself that had summoned me to a confrontation. The shock was so great that time seemed to stand still. I looked at the clock, but the hands no longer made sense. I felt trapped between two worlds, the one before, where I had a home, and the one now, where I was a stranger in my own story. This invisible line separated who I was from who I would become. And it was in that emptiness that I understood. The call hadn't just been a practical message. It had been a deep cut, a turning point. Nothing would be the same after that moment. The phrase, "Don't come home," wasn't just a warning, it was a sentence. And I knew that, from then on, my life would have to be told in two parts, before and after that call. When I hung up the phone, I stood there, motionless, the receiver still pressed to my ear, as if waiting to hear something more. The silence that filled the house was so deafening it felt like screaming. There was no street noise, no birds, no nothing. Just the weight of an absence that settled inside me like a stone. Silence has a cruelty all its own. It's not empty, it's full of echoes. Every word my son said came back to me as if it were being repeated inside the walls. Don't come home. Don't come home. The phrase circled around in my head, leaving me breathless. I tried to shake off the echo, but it was impossible. I sat at the table, my hand still trembling. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, but I didn't have the strength to get up and turn it off. The whistle became part of the piercing silence, like a lament from the house itself. The coffee burned, but I only realized it much later, when the bitter smell filled the room. The silence also affected my body. I felt my heart racing, beating out of rhythm, as if it wanted to burst from my chest. My legs felt heavy, as if they didn't belong to me. It was as if my entire body had rebelled against what I'd heard. And there I was, without reaction, trying to find a logic to the absurd. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The hand moved, but for me, time had stopped. I felt as if I were suspended in limbo, trapped between the life I knew and the one I didn't yet understand. Silence was the space in between, an abyss into which I fell, unsure of where I would end up. Anyone who's ever received devastating news knows what I'm talking about. It's that moment when the world keeps spinning, but inside you, everything freezes. The noise of the city continues, but it makes no sense. It's like watching a movie without sound. You see, but you don't hear, you don't participate. I was like that, disconnected from life, although still breathing. In this silence, questions arose that I couldn't keep quiet. Where did I go wrong? How did I get to this point? Had I failed to see the signs? Each question was a dagger, because none of them had an answer. The silence, once again, offered no explanation, only increased the anguish. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. I just looked at the ceiling and thought, Lord, help me not to go crazy now. It was a silent prayer, spoken more from the heart than from the mouth. And in a way, this silence also became a space for a silent faith, as if heaven could hear even what was unspoken. But I soon realized I couldn't stay still forever. The silence could swallow me, and I didn't want to be swallowed by it. I braced my hands on the table, took a deep breath, and decided to stand. It was as if I were breaking out of an invisible prison. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to move. And so, amidst silence and trembling, I understood that this was only the first step. The call had broken something within me, but the silence was showing me something else, that I would have to move forward, even without answers. And deep down, I knew that the memories awaiting me in the rooms of the house would be even louder than the emptiness consuming me. I got up slowly and walked through the house. Each step was a plunge into memories that insisted on embracing me. The walls held voices, laughter, arguments, and silences that only those who lived inside them could understand. They weren't just walls, they were witnesses. And each one seemed to stare back at me, as if asking, "And now, what will become of you?" In the living room, I saw the armchair where he'd slept as a child, wrapped in a blue blanket that's long gone. There, too, remained the sound of the television playing low when I didn't want to wake him, and the smell of hot chocolate I'd made on cold nights. I felt a pang in my chest, as if those details had been ripped away along with the room that no longer belonged to me. I went to the kitchen. The cabinet still bore small handprints from when he'd insisted on opening the door to get hidden cookies. I smiled, remembering, but soon the smile faded. Today, that same boy I protected was driving me away with words. How could a kitchen that was once the heart of the home feel like a strange place now? I went up to his room, even though I knew I wouldn't find what I expected. The space was different, but I could still see the shadows of the past. I saw the scattered toys, heard the loud music of his adolescence, smelled the cheap perfume he used to impress someone. All of this was no longer there, but it was inside me, pulsing. Souvenirs have scent, color, and texture. I ran my hand along the wall and felt as if I could feel the vibration of every time I'd knocked on it to invite him to dinner. Memory isn't just mental, it clings to objects, to spaces. And that's why it hurts so much to know my things had been donated, as if someone had decided to erase pieces of my life without asking permission. I also remembered the backyard. How many times had he run through it, falling and getting up, getting his clothes dirty, and then coming to show me his scratches like trophies? I tended to his wounds with ointment and kisses, believing that care would be enough to protect him from the world. Now I realized there was no ointment capable of healing the wound he himself had inflicted on me. It's funny how we associate rooms in the house with specific moments. For me, every corner held a piece of our history. The hallway of our first races, the makeshift party room, the bedroom of teenage secrets. Walking through it was like opening an invisible photo album where each memory leaped out uninvited. Yet there were also memories of pain. The feverish nights, the tears hidden so he wouldn't see, the tough arguments every mother and child eventually have. These memories were there too, mixed with the good ones, forming a fabric of real life, where joy and pain are woven together. And yet, I never imagined this fabric could be torn so cruelly. As I walked back to the living room, I felt an even greater pang. The souvenirs, which had once been a comfort, were now daggers, because they reminded me of everything we had and how much of it had been lost. It was as if each memory told me, "Look closely, because you will never be the same again." And it was in that moment that I realized the memories weren't there to comfort me, but to prepare me. They were showing me that, as much as home was filled with memories, I would need to learn to live without it. And that thought sent a deep chill down my spine, as if the hands of time were pushing me toward the next pain I would yet face. My hands began to shake without me realizing it. I only noticed when I tried to hold a cup, and the sound of the glass hitting the table echoed through the kitchen. The noise seemed louder than it was, perhaps because it reflected exactly how I felt inside, fragile, on the verge of shattering. With each tremor, it felt like my entire body was remembering the age I'd always tried to ignore. I braced my hands on the table to steady myself, but even this familiar surface seemed to slip. It was as if the wood no longer recognized me, as if I were a stranger in my own home. The aging body has these cruelties. The more we need it to be steady, the more it gives in to wavering. And this made me feel even more vulnerable. I looked at my fingers. They were no longer the same ones that sewed clothes at night to pay the bills, nor the same ones that held my little son when he was afraid of the dark. The bulging veins, the marks of time, the brittle nails, everything reminded me that youth was gone, but that the stories remained there, like scars that tell without words. The tremor also came from my soul. It was as if my entire being was in shock, unsure how to react to the rejection. My trembling hands weren't just a symptom of age or physical frailty. They were the expression of a broken heart, of a mind trying to cling to anything to keep from losing itself. I wasn't just trembling, I was fighting not to fall apart. I grabbed a glass of water and brought it to my lips. Half of it spilled before it reached the water, wetting my blouse. This simple gesture, which I performed my entire life without thinking, now became a challenge. I felt ashamed, even though I was alone. It's strange how we can feel self-conscious, as if there were an invisible audience judging us. It was at that moment that I took a deep breath and whispered, "Calm down." I don't know if I was speaking to myself or to my hands. Sometimes we need to become our own mother, to embrace ourselves with care when there's no one to hold. I ran my fingers along the hem of my skirt like someone caressing a child, and that simple repetition brought a brief, but necessary peace. The memory took me back to the day I held my feverish son in my arms. I, too, trembled that night, afraid of losing him. But the tremors, back then, came from love, not rejection. It's curious how the body stores these memories, repeating the gestures in different contexts. Today, my hands trembled with pain, but they were still the same ones that once trembled with care. The tremors gradually subsided, but they didn't disappear completely. They remained as a subtle reminder, a constant nudge that said, "You're not in control." This feeling was hard to accept. I had spent my entire life trying to keep everything together, but in that moment, I realized there were things I could never control, not my son's words, not my own body. Still, the tremor taught me something. When we tremble, it's because we're still alive. It's a sign that our hearts keep beating, even when wounded. This apparent weakness is also a form of resilience because it shows that, despite everything, we keep trying to find our balance. My trembling hands were, paradoxically, proof that I hadn't given up. And as I looked at them one last time before rising, I knew I would need all the strength I had left. Because if my hands were already betraying me, the path back to the truth could be even more cruel. It was time to face not only the weakness of my body, but also that of my heart. And I knew the next stage of this journey would begin outside the walls of my home. I bought the train ticket like a piece of courage. The coins clinked in my hand, each one weighing more than it should. I stepped onto the train slowly, clutching my purse to my chest as if it were my last possession. It wasn't just a return trip. It was the path to a truth I didn't want to see, but had to face. The wooden bench was hard, but it didn't hurt more than the memory of the connection. I rested my head against the glass and watched the landscape pass by in reverse. Trees, small houses, streets full of strangers. The train made a measured noise, tack-tack, tack-tack, that seemed to dictate the rhythm of my breathing. And with each beat, I asked myself, why, my God, why did my own son do this to me? As the train rolled on, the people around me chatted, laughed, whispered secrets. I watched them with a lump in my throat. For them, it was just another day. For me, it was the day I returned to a home that might no longer be mine. The world's indifference hurt almost as much as my son's words. I clutched my bag tighter. Inside were some old letters, a handkerchief, and a yellowed photograph of our last Christmas together. These objects were my silent support, as if they held the weight of the journey with me. Sometimes, when the pain is great, we don't need grand speeches, but symbols that remind us we still belong. I looked at my wrinkled hands on the fabric of my bag. They were no longer nimble, but still held firm enough not to let go. And I thought, if I can hold this, I can hold myself. That was my first prayer on the train, a silent prayer of resistance. The wind blew in through the half-open window and ruffled my scarf. I let it. It was as if the air were saying, you're still alive." And indeed, as much as it hurt, I was still breathing. Each gust of wind was a reminder that I couldn't give up, not now. There was still a part of the story to be told, and I needed to be standing to hear it. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my face, scarred by time. I thought about how many trains I'd taken, to visit relatives, to look for work, to care for my son. But never had a train been as heavy as that one. Not because of the distance, but because of the truth that awaited me at the destination. The shortest journey had become the longest of my life. Memories mingled with the landscape. Every child running through the station reminded me of him as a child. Every couple embracing made me think of how hard I'd always fought to ensure he'd never feel alone. But ironically, there I was alone, going to meet a son who'd thrown me out without even looking me in the eye. I closed my eyes and silently asked for strength. I didn't ask for the pain to go away because I knew it wouldn't. I only asked for the courage to face it, because some pains don't disappear. We only learn to carry them without stumbling so much. This train wasn't just carrying my body. It was also carrying my soul in search of answers. And when I finally heard the whistle announcing arrival, a shiver ran down my spine. The train stopped, but I didn't want to get off. Part of me wanted to stay there, riding forever, without having to face what awaited me. But destiny doesn't wait, and life doesn't stop. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bag, and stood up. The real wait began from that moment on. As the train rocked, my thoughts took me back to when my son was just a toddler. I'd see him running around the yard, tripping over his own feet, and coming back to me with scraped knees. It was always the same scene. He'd cry loudly, but all it took was a kiss on the bruise to fix everything. How could that boy need me so much in the past, and now he's pushing me out of his life? I remembered the sleepless nights when he had a fever, and I'd sit by his bed, praying he'd get better soon. I'd change wet cloths on his forehead, hold his small hand, and promise myself I'd never let him go unattended. He was my entire world, and caring for him made me forget even myself. Those images came back like a painful movie. Good memories also surfaced. The first time he said, "Mommy," it was an almost shy whisper, but it filled the house with light. I remember when he brought me a crooked drawing with the phrase, "I love you," misspelled on it. I treasured that paper as if it were gold. For me, every gesture of his was a treasure I carried in my heart. The scent of her childhood still seemed to be there. Cheap shampoo, sweet soap, and the scent of clean clothes drying on the line. Little things that, at the time, seemed trivial, but are precious today. When life rips away the present, memory is all that remains, and it is in memory that we find shelter, even if it is a shelter filled with pain. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. I also remembered the fights, the stubbornness of adolescence, the slammed doors, and the harsh words he'd said to me in moments of anger. At the time, I believed it was just a phase, that it would soon pass. I never imagined that these small breakups would be the harbinger of something bigger, more cruel. As these memories flashed through my mind, I felt a tightness in my chest. It was as if I were losing my son twice. First the sweet boy who remained in the past, and now the man who rejected me in the present. The pain doubled because it carried both absence and ingratitude. I closed my eyes and thought about how many times I'd promised him I'd always be by his side. Promises made on stormy nights, in days of famine, in times of hardship. I'd kept them all. But now it was he who seemed to have forgotten his own words. "Mom, when I grow up, I'll take care of you." That promise echoed in my memory like irony. The memories, though painful, also showed me that I hadn't failed in love. I loved with all my strength, giving what I had and what I didn't. If he turned his back on me today, it didn't erase the fact that I fulfilled my role as a mother. His responsibility was different, not to forget. I looked out the train window and saw a child hugging his mother on a station platform. That simple scene made me cry softly. It was like watching a reflection of what I once had, but which no longer exists. Tears fell, not only from the pain of the present, but from the longing for the past that never returns. And it was in this whirlwind of memories that I realized each memory came as a preparation, as if life were showing me, through the past, the strength I would need to face the future. Because memories, even painful ones, are proof that I lived and that I could still withstand what was to come. Inside my purse, I kept some letters he'd written when he was a teenager. I kept them with me like a charm against loneliness. On the train, I pulled the envelope out carefully, as if it were glass about to shatter. I didn't dare open it. All I had to do was feel the paper under my fingers and hear his voice echo in my memory. One of the letters had a juice stain that had never come out. Another carried the smell of an old cabinet. They were frozen pieces of time, memories the world couldn't erase. "Mom, I'm sorry. Sometimes I make mistakes," said one of the phrases I remembered by heart. Reading it years ago brought me relief. Now, it only deepened the wound. I ran my fingers over the crooked handwriting. Each letter was a confession he, at the time, couldn't say out loud. It's curious how paper has this power. It holds the weight of words that the mouth can't. For me, these letters were proof that, at some point, he recognized my effort, even if it was only a timid draft. I couldn't read them to the end. I put them back like someone returning a jewel to a safe. An open letter bleeds, and I was already bleeding too much. It was enough to know they were there, existing, reminding me that there was a time when I was needed, when my love was valuable. As I caressed the envelopes, I thought about the contrast between past and present. The same son who wrote me apologies and declarations of affection was now telling me not to come home. Life sometimes has a cruel irony. It makes us treasure tokens of love that, in the future, turn into invisible daggers. Yet I couldn't dismiss those letters. As painful as they were pieces of a truth that once existed. And to deny that would be to deny a part of myself as well. I tucked them away in the bottom of my purse, next to the handkerchief I always carry with me, as if I were building a small, silent altar. I remembered when he handed me the first one. Embarrassed, his face flushed. "Mom, don't laugh, okay?" he said. I smiled, but I never laughed at him. On the contrary, I felt such tenderness that even today my heart warms when I remember it. Those letters carried not just words, but the image of a boy who no longer exists. As I held those papers, I understood that love is never lost. It can be forgotten, stifled, rejected, but it never ceases to exist. And perhaps that's what hurts so much, remembering that love existed and realizing that it wasn't enough to prevent what happened. The rocking of the train rocked my memories, and I wondered, does he still remember those letters? Does he still have something I wrote? Or has he erased everything, like he did with my belongings, like he did with my room? These questions were sharp knives, but they were also signs that I hadn't given up on him yet. I closed my eyes and clutched the bag to my chest. I didn't need to open the letters to feel what was inside. The mere weight of the envelopes was enough to remind me that, even if the present was cruel, the past was still etched in paper, in ink, and, above all, in me. With each jolt of the train, I felt my body complain. My bones no longer held the same strength they once did, and my back ached as if carrying decades of memories along with the weight of the journey. The hard seat seemed to mock me, reminding me that I no longer had the stamina of a young woman. The weight of age isn't just on the body, it's also on the soul. I looked at my hands resting in my lap. The veins bulged, the thin skin, the marks left by time. These same hands that once washed clothes until dawn, that held my feverish son, now trembled as they held a simple handkerchief. Old age comes quietly, but when the pain sets in, it screams loudly, and there's no way to pretend we don't hear it. The weight of age also resides in comparisons. When I was young, I would climb hills without thinking, wake up early, and take care of the entire house with enthusiasm. Now, every step felt like a challenge. Every effort required a pause. It's hard to admit that my body doesn't respond as it once did. It's as if, little by little, the world was shrinking our margins of choice. But what weighs most heavily isn't the physical limitations, it's the feeling of being discarded. The son who promised to protect me now treated me like a nuisance. This was the true weight of aging, no longer being seen as a pillar, but as a burden. Wrinkles don't hurt as much as the feeling of invisibility before the ones you love most. I remembered when I was the one carrying everything, heavy bags, doubled worries, problems no one else wanted to shoulder. Back then, fatigue set in, but I knew I was building a future for him. Today, the future has arrived, but it seemed to spit on the past. What was once a source of pride was now treated as excess. I sighed deeply and looked at the window, which reflected my tired face. The lines around my eyes weren't just from age. They were from sleepless nights, from held-back tears, from hopes unfulfilled. Old age imprints the story of a life on the body, and sometimes that story is heavier than any bag you can carry. It's curious how society also reinforces this burden. How many times have I heard phrases like, "At your age, you can't do this anymore," or "It's better to leave it to younger people"? These words, spoken as advice, are actually bricks that push us off track. Old age, when not embraced, becomes exile. Yet, even with this weight, there's a hidden strength. Age has given me the ability to endure pain that would have previously crushed me. I may not be able to run like I used to, but I've learned to endure with calm. This learning is invisible, but it's what kept me sitting there, steady, even with my heart broken. As the train rolled on, I realized that the weight of age wasn't just punishment. It was also a reminder that I'd survived everything up to this point. I'd already weathered storms, losses, illnesses, and even my husband's death. If I'd made it this far, I could face this one too. The body may weaken, but the soul, when nourished by faith, finds ways to stand upright. And it was in that thought that I understood. The weight of age can bend our shoulders, but it cannot break our dignity. I still had a choice about how to carry my pain. And I decided that, however heavy it was, I would not let my son's ingratitude define who I am. Because age can take away strength, but it should never take away the value of a lifetime. When I got off the train and walked to my home street, my heart was beating faster than my legs could keep up. The gate was there, the same as always, but it felt different. It was no longer a familiar entrance. It was like a cold guardian, asking me if I still had the right to pass. I stood before it, key in hand, and felt that the iron gate weighed more than all my invisible suitcases. I approached slowly, afraid of what I would find beyond the gate. I touched the cold iron, and felt a shiver run down my arms. It was as if the gate knew the call, as if it too had heard my son say, "Don't come back." The metal didn't speak, but its silence was accusatory, as if it had already chosen its side. I gripped the key tightly. For a moment, I thought he might have changed the lock, and the mere thought made my legs weak. I imagined myself trying to turn the key and hearing only the dry click of rejection. This thought made me take a deep breath, like someone preparing for a sentence. I fitted the key into the lock with trembling hands. The sound of scraping metal echoed inside me like a verdict. I turned slowly, hesitantly, and heard the click. The gate gave way, as if it still recognized my hands. But instead of relief, I felt a deep sadness. Opening the door didn't mean I still had a home. I pushed open the gate and entered the backyard. The ground felt harder than before, as if it were pushing me out with every step. The wind swayed the trees, but that movement wasn't a welcome. It was a farewell. Walking through my own backyard became an invasion. I was in my own home, but it wasn't mine anymore. The gate creaked shut behind me, and the sound cut through me. It was as if it had closed not only on the outside, but also on the inside. The feeling was one of imprisonment and, at the same time, of exile. I was inside, but I no longer belonged. I was an unwanted guest in a place I had helped build. I looked around and saw details that hurt me even more. The flower pot I tended was gone. My husband's tools were no longer on the wall. Each absence screamed that my presence was also no longer needed. It wasn't just the gate that closed. It was the recognition of my history that was locked out. I stood in the middle of the yard, listening to the sounds of the street behind me. The world went on as normal. Children playing, cars passing, neighbors talking. But here, inside the gate, everything seemed dead. The contrast between life outside and the emptiness inside was unbearable. I bent down and touched the garden soil, as if searching for a piece of myself in that soil. My hands became dirty, but I didn't find what I was looking for. Perhaps I was trying to grasp a feeling that no longer existed. Because the gate may open, but once love closes, nothing is ever the same again. I stood up slowly, tears welling in my eyes, and faced the front door. If the gate had already hurt me, what would I find inside? I took a deep breath, knowing the next sight might be even more cruel. But he also knew there was no turning back. I had already crossed the first barrier. Now I would have to face what was left of my home. I pushed open my bedroom door carefully, as if I didn't want to wake a sick person. But what I found inside wasn't asleep. It was dead. The space was empty. The bed that had so often supported me on lonely nights was gone. The curtain I'd embroidered myself was gone. Even the trunk where I kept letters, photos, and keepsakes of my husband was gone. The absence of everything wasn't just physical. It was an absence that screamed, that hurt. The emptiness of that room had weight. It was as if each object removed had taken a piece of my history with it. I felt as if I myself had been carried out, without the right to express my opinion. What remained were cold walls, incapable of recognizing me. I approached the corner where the trunk stood. I touched the ground, as if searching for traces of a body. Nothing. Just dust and silence. There were stored my dresses from special occasions, souvenirs that kept me going through difficult times. Knowing everything had been donated without my consent felt like a theft. Not just of objects, but of identity. I sat on the cold floor. The icy towel stuck to my legs, and I cried soundlessly. It was a dry cry, the kind that doesn't need tears to exist. I ran my hands through the air, as if groping for absences. I tried to find a smell, a scrap of fabric, any detail that would restore my sense of belonging. But there was nothing. It's strange how loud emptiness can be. The silence in the room seemed louder than any scream. It echoed there every night I prayed, every day I woke early to make my bed, every time I sat down to write a letter. All of that was now just a memory without a place. In the corner, I found a small button forgotten on the floor. I picked it up carefully, like someone holding a jewel. That button was worthless to others, but to me it was the last vestige of something that had once been mine. I kept it in my pocket like an anchor. Sometimes, a tiny detail can be what keeps us from sinking completely. As I gazed at the empty room, I thought about how cruel it is when someone decides to erase another person's history. They weren't just clearing a space. They were silently saying, "You don't matter anymore." This was the deepest wound, because objects can be replaced, but the feeling of being discarded is irreparable. I closed my eyes and tried to mentally reconstruct what it had been like before. I saw the made bed, the trunk in the corner, the soft light streaming through the curtains. For a few seconds, I managed to believe nothing had changed. But when I opened my eyes, the emptiness brought me back to reality. There was no escaping the fact. My room was no longer mine. I knelt in the center of the room and ran my hand along the floor in a circle, as if marking out an invisible territory. I'm still here, I thought. Even if they'd taken everything, there was still my presence, my body, my heart. The space might have been emptied, but as long as I breathed there, the room still held my name. I stood up slowly, feeling a weight settle on my shoulders. The empty room wasn't just proof of my son's rejection. It was also a warning that the pain to come would be even greater. If they'd already erased my space, what else was left to be ripped from me? I took a deep breath and braced myself. The wound was open, but I knew there was still more to face. As soon as I closed the bedroom door, a familiar scent greeted me. It was as if the past had permeated the air, insisting on embracing me. I smelled the faint scent of laundry detergent mixed with the aroma of old coffee that seemed to still linger in the walls. The smell caught me off guard, and for a moment I thought I was back in time when everything was simple. Smell has this power to open hidden drawers of memory. That scent took me straight to the mornings I'd wake up early to make breakfast before he went to school. The aroma of bread warming in the oven still seemed to be there, permeating the tiles. I closed my eyes and almost heard my son's hurried footsteps, asking for extra butter, as he always did. I walked around the living room and took a deep breath. There were still traces of hot soup from Sunday lunches, when the whole family would gather. The smell of garlic browning in the pan seemed to hide among the furniture, as if afraid to leave. It was as if the house held a piece of each moment, like a mother holds memories in her heart. The past also manifested itself in the backyard. The scent of the flowers I'd planted myself seemed to linger, even though the pots were gone. It was a sweet, light scent that made me smile for a moment. But the smile quickly faded as I remembered that I was the one who cared for those flowers, and that now even that wasn't mine anymore. The scent also brought back memories of my husband. The scent of his cologne still seemed to be trapped somewhere in the closet, even after all these years. This detail made me shiver. It was as if the house was saying, "He was here, he loved you." And the absence of him in that moment weighed even more heavily on me, because I needed someone to shield me from that pain. It's curious how smells linger when everything else disappears. Clothes can be donated, furniture sold, but the smell insists on remaining, like a silent witness. And that's precisely what hurts, because it reminds us of everything we've experienced but can't recover. The scent of memory is both sweet and bitter at the same time. I ran my hand along the walls, as if I could smell the aroma more closely. I remembered the afternoons I'd bake cornmeal cake, and the smell would attract neighbors, who would always drop by for a quick coffee and end up staying for hours. Their laughter seemed to still linger in the air. But now, that same air tasted of absence. I stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly. Each breath was a plunge into memories that comforted and hurt me at the same time. It's strange to miss something that still exists physically, but is no longer yours. The house exuded the past, but expelled me in the present. The tears came silently as the scent continued to envelop me. It was as if the house was trying to comfort me, saying, "I remember you." But at the same time, it reminded me that I was no longer part of it. It was an embrace that welcomed and rejected at the same time. And as I wiped my eyes, I realized that the scent wouldn't disappear. It would remain etched in my memory, following me wherever I went. It was as if the past had become an invisible scent I would carry forever, even if I could never call it home again. As I walked through the yard, trying to digest the pain of the empty room and the smell of the past, I heard a low voice behind the side gate. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" It was my neighbor, the same one who always brought me ripe mangoes when they fell from his tree. I recognized his tone of concern, but also embarrassment. He didn't want to intrude, but he couldn't remain silent. I approached the gate, discreetly wiping away my tears. He looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and helplessness. "I saw people taking furniture. I thought you already knew." That statement was a blow. The whole world seemed to know what was happening, except me, the true owner of the memories that had been ripped away. I stood there for a few seconds without a response. What could I say? That my son had kicked me out? That what he saw as furniture were pieces of my history? I swallowed hard and just nodded, as if to say, everything's under control. But the truth was, nothing was. My life had become a silent spectacle for those watching from the outside. He tried to lighten the mood. "If you need anything, you know you can count on me." I thanked him with a weak smile. Neighbors always offer help, but there are pains that cannot be shared. They can lend a cup of sugar, but they cannot sweeten the bitterness of a rejected heart. Inside, I felt ashamed, not for myself, but for him. The son I'd raised, whom so many neighbors had praised when he was little, was now the subject of whispers. I knew that from then on, comments would arise. How could a son do this to his own mother? And, in a way, this hurt me even more because it exposed our intimacy. The neighbor scratched his head, clearly embarrassed. "You've always been so good to him," he said, almost in a whisper. Those words were like salt in the wound, because I knew I'd done everything I could, and hearing it from someone else only confirmed the injustice of the situation. It hurt even more to realize that even from the outside, it was clear how undeserving I was. I looked at him and realized there was sincerity in his concern. Even though he couldn't solve anything, he was trying to offer me something: recognition. Sometimes being seen is a form of comfort. Knowing that someone sees our pain, even if they can't erase it, reminds us that we're not completely alone. But there was also a limit. I didn't want to open up too much, didn't want to turn my pain into a neighborhood conversation. So I thanked him again, my voice breaking, and went back inside. The gate between us seemed to symbolize the barrier between what others could know and what I was willing to reveal. As I walked away, I heard the sounds of the street, children playing, people talking, life going on. The contrast was stark. To them, everything was normal. To me, the world had fallen apart. I returned to the room carrying not only the weight of emptiness, but also the worried gaze of those who witnessed my fall from outside. And in that moment, I understood that the greatest pain wasn't just losing my home, but having to face reality in front of witnesses. My drama was no longer just mine, it was visible to others. And this prepared me, in a harsh way, for the inevitable moment, the meeting with my son, where there would be no neighbors or excuses. Just the two of us, face to face, without masks. When the living room door finally opened, my heart stopped for a second. There he was, my son, the same boy who once hid behind me when he was afraid. But now, before me, was a man with a look I barely recognized. There was no brightness, no tenderness. There was only distance. Our eyes met, and in that instant, time seemed to freeze. I wanted to run and hug him, but my legs wouldn't move. He didn't take a step toward me either. We stood still, like strangers sizing each other up before deciding whether they were friends or enemies. The silence in that gaze was heavier than any words. The eyes say more than the mouth. In his, I saw haste, exhaustion, and a calculated coldness. In mine, I don't know what he saw. Maybe sadness, maybe hope, maybe a love that insisted on surviving even after everything. Inside, I screamed, "I'm your mother." But outside, I remained silent, afraid of frightening him with the intensity of my pain. It's strange to look at someone you gave birth to and feel like they no longer belong to you. I remembered his eyes as a child, wide and full of curiosity, always searching for me. Now, they were the same eyes, but hardened by hurts I didn't yet understand. It felt like an invisible wall between us. He looked away for a moment, and it cut through me. It was as if looking at me was too difficult, as if I were a mirror he didn't want to see. The rejection wasn't just in the words he'd said on the phone, but also in that simple gesture of refusal. His refusal to look at me was more painful than any sentence. I thought about saying something, but my voice betrayed me. I felt the lump in my throat suffocating me, preventing any sound from coming out. So I took a deep breath and held my ground. Because sometimes silence speaks too, and in that moment my silence said, "I'm still here." He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, as if he had already prepared a speech. His body spoke as much as his eyes, defensive, closed, ready to protect himself from something that might not even be happening. And that made me wonder, was he more afraid of me than I was of him? The first glance between us wasn't a reunion, it was a confrontation. It was as if we were on opposite sides of a field, waiting to see who would make the first move. I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to be a hug, tears, reconciliation. But life doesn't always give us what we want. Even so, in that frozen gaze, I could still see a glimmer. Behind the hardness, there was something hidden. Pain. It was subtle, but it was there. Maybe he didn't want to show it. Maybe he didn't even know he was letting it out. But I saw it. Because a mother always sees it, even when her son pretends nothing is wrong. And it was that detail, that shadow of pain behind the coldness, that gave me the strength to keep standing. I knew what was to come wouldn't be easy. The words he had for me would be harsh. But that first look showed me something important. No matter how much he tried to hide it, my son still carried something that connected him to me. And it was through that crack that I would try to reach his heart. He took a deep breath, as if rehearsing a speech, and then said, "Mom, I had to do what was best." The words came like knives, sharpened by indifference. His voice was firm, but without warmth. It didn't tremble, didn't waver. It was as if he'd rehearsed every syllable to leave no room for doubt. He continued, "The house needed changes. I couldn't afford it all on my own anymore. I rented out your room because it was the only way. Your things, I couldn't keep them anymore." Each sentence was a hammer hitting the same spot, breaking a little more of what was left inside me. He was talking about objects, but I knew they weren't just objects. They were pieces of my life. As he spoke, I felt a strange mixture of anger and compassion. Anger because it felt like my love was being translated into numbers, into bills to pay. Compassion because I realized that, behind the coldness, there was a lost man, trying to justify the unjustifiable. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could justify the cruelty of erasing his mother from his own home. He avoided looking me in the eye as he spoke. He remained leaning against the wall, arms crossed, like a judge reading a sentence. And there I was, the defendant, accused of being a burden, accused of being leftovers. There was no shouting, no direct insults, but the words were even worse, because they were wrapped in cold logic. I tried to interrupt, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. This gesture hit me like a slap. I, who had spent my entire life listening to his fears, his pain, his joys, was now forced to listen in silence, as if I were an intruder. My heart pounded, begging me to scream, but my mouth didn't respond. He continued, "I couldn't go on like this. I needed to think about myself. I needed space. I hope you understand." Understand? How can you understand that your own life has been boxed up and given away like trash? How can you accept that what was once home is now just space? The worst part is that he meant it. He truly believed what he said. At that moment, I realized that harsh words aren't just the ones that hurt, but also the ones that try to transform pain into logic. Because when someone applies rationality to rejection, it's like throwing ice on an open wound. Instead of healing, it numbs it. And the anesthesia, sooner or later, wears off, and the pain returns even stronger. As he continued to justify himself, I thought about how many times I'd spoken harsh words to him as a child. Sometimes to set boundaries, sometimes in the heat of anger. But my words were filled with love, even when they sounded firm. His weren't. His were meant to sever ties, to separate worlds. The most painful thing was realizing he wasn't aware of the violence hidden in his speech. To him, he was simply being honest, direct, and realistic. To me, it was like being erased from life. Each explanation he gave was a brick in the wall that now separated us. And the more he spoke, the more I understood this wasn't an ordinary conversation. It was a judgment. When he finished, silence filled the room again. But it wasn't the same silence as before, heavy with memories. It was a heavy, tense silence, full of things that couldn't be put into words. I remained silent, not because I agreed, but because I knew any answer could further inflame the distance between us. And it was in that silence that I prepared my heart for the next choice, to remain silent or to speak. When he finished speaking, the room grew heavy. I could have responded. I could have relived all the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the pain I'd borne alone so he could have a future. But I didn't. I chose silence. Not out of weakness, but because I understood that words in that moment would be like gasoline on a blazing fire. I folded my hands in my lap, took a deep breath, and just stared at him. My gaze said so much more than any words could express. Deep down, I wanted him to see in my eyes the mother who never stopped loving, the woman who didn't give up even when life was hard. My silence was both my defense and my weapon. Inside, however, a storm consumed me. I screamed to myself, "Speak up, react, don't accept this." But my heart told me something else. Hold on, let it empty itself. So I chose to listen to my heart, because sometimes love needs to manifest itself this way, without words, just through resistance. He found my silence strange. I noticed a certain discomfort on his face, as if he expected an explosion, an angry response. But I didn't give it. And his discomfiture showed me that, somehow, my silence had power. Perhaps more power than any speech. Silence is like a mirror. It forces the other to see themselves. And in that moment, I wanted him to see himself, not just as a son, but as a man before his own mother. I wanted him to perceive the harshness of his own words, the coldness of his own gaze. Words could be ignored, but silence could not. It lingers, it disturbs, it weighs. As we stood there, face to face, I remembered other times when I'd chosen silence. When he'd come home hurt by cruel words from colleagues, I wouldn't lecture him. I'd just hug him. And that silence spoke louder than 1,000 pieces of advice. Maybe, deep down, I was trying to repeat the same gesture now, but in a different way. It was at that moment that I realized something important. Silence also protects. If I spoke, I might say things I would regret. I might hurt him even more, and I didn't want that. My silence was, at once, a shield for me and for him. It was like a silent prayer, asking God to put into my expressions what my mouth couldn't translate. But anyone who thinks silence is easy is mistaken. It hurts. It corrodes from within. The throat burns. The soul cries out for a voice. Remaining quiet requires more strength than arguing. I was exhausted, but I knew I had to resist. It was like holding back a huge wave with my bare hands. Little by little, I noticed the silence beginning to give way. He took a deeper breath, shifted his crossed arms, and looked away. It was a sign that something in him was also moving, even if it wasn't enough. And in that small gesture, I saw a glimmer of humanity, a gap through which perhaps love could still enter. And it was in that moment that I understood. My silence wasn't giving up, it was hope. A timid hope, but real. I didn't know if it would have an immediate effect, but I knew I was planting something. Because sometimes a mother's silence can echo louder than any shouted word. He invited me to dinner, and for a moment, I thought it might be a gesture of rapprochement. I sat at the table where he'd so often served steaming soups, homemade cakes, and impromptu birthdays. But that night, the table felt different. What had once been a symbol of unity was now neutral territory, almost a silent trench between us. The plates were placed, but the food was flavorless. I chewed the rice and beans as if chewing sand. With each bite, I remembered the times he'd come home from school and devour 3 plates at once, laughing at my scolding for eating too quickly. Now, he barely looked up, as if the meal were just an obligation. The sound of silverware scraping against plates echoed louder than any words. I wanted to ask if he was okay, if he was sleeping well, if he needed anything. But I swallowed my questions along with the bland food. I was afraid any word I said would be interpreted as an accusation, and I didn't want any more walls between us. As I watched him out of the corner of my eye, I saw that he, too, seemed uncomfortable. He ate slowly, picking at his food more than actually eating. There was a heaviness to the table that no tablecloth could cover. It was as if we were both there, but each trapped inside our own island. Memories of family lunches flooded me. The laughter, the lively discussions, the soft music on the radio in the background. I could almost hear it all at that very table. But now, there was only silence, silverware, and hearts full of unsaid things. The contrast hurt so much it felt like the memory was mocking me. I tried to smile, but the gesture died on my lips. He noticed, but didn't return it. And that detail was more painful than any harsh words I'd ever heard. Sometimes, no answer is crueler than a negative one. His silence said, "Don't involve me." I finished eating first and set my plate aside. He was still fiddling with his, avoiding my eyes. The table, once a family altar, was now just a piece of furniture with plates stacked on top of each other. The feeling of not belonging was in every detail, in the glass that wasn't mine, in the plate I hadn't chosen, in the tablecloth without my housewifely hands. I stood up slowly, thanking him for the meal in a whisper. He simply nodded, wordless. I felt there was no invitation there, just protocol, as if he was trying to play a role to ease his own conscience, without truly connecting with me. As I walked into the living room, I looked back and saw the table set, but empty of meaning. It was like looking at an old portrait and realizing the people were gone. The table was full of food, but hungry for love. And that hunger was worse than any empty stomach. And in that moment, I understood. Dinner hadn't been an attempt at reconciliation, but just another reminder of the distance between us. It was the beginning of a long night in which I would have to face not only the weight of rejection, but also the loneliness inside a home that was no longer mine. After dinner, he leaned against the doorframe and was silent for a few seconds. I knew something was stuck in his throat, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Until finally he murmured, "Mom, there was a lot left back there, things you might never have noticed." My heart sank. Those words were like stones dropped slowly, but they still hurt. He spoke of times he felt alone, of absences I couldn't even remember. He said that as a teenager, he held grudges for working too much, for not being home often. For me, it was a struggle for survival. For him, it had been abandonment. I heard each word like silent stabs. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd sewn all night to pay for his studies, that I'd taken on heavy labor so he wouldn't go hungry. But I kept quiet, because I realized his past wasn't the same as mine. What was sacrifice for me became absence for him. It was painful to face this version of our story, to discover that, while I was proud of having been strong, he harbored resentment for having felt distant. Two truths living under the same roof, but never meeting. This is how families are torn apart without realizing it, not by great tragedies, but by small, unspoken wounds. He cited specific moments. The time he fell ill and I, exhausted, dozed off beside his bed. For me, I was present. For him, I had given up on him in that moment. Different memories of the same episode, each with its own weight. And this showed me that there's no point in trying to fix the past. It has already fixed itself in each person's memory in its own way. As he spoke, I noticed discreet tears in his eyes. They weren't tears of current pain, but of hidden wounds. And for the first time, I understood that perhaps my struggle for survival had taken a heavy toll. Not that I'd been wrong to take care of the house and pay the bills, but because, in the process, I'd failed to see his loneliness. The urge to justify myself was overwhelming, but I held it back. Because I saw he didn't need an explanation, he needed to be heard. Sometimes healing begins when someone finally has the courage to say what they've never said. So I just nodded, making it clear I was listening, without interrupting, without looking away. It was at that moment that I realized something bigger. We were both trapped in an unspoken past, each carrying our own side of the story, never confronting it. And now, after so long, it was exploding viciously. Perhaps if we had talked sooner, we wouldn't have reached the point of being strangers in the same house. The unsaid past has this destructive power. It accumulates like dust until it suffocates. And when it finally emerges, it's not clean, it's full of hurt, distorted by time. I felt this in every sentence he said, but I also saw that, by letting it out, he felt relief, even if only a little. In that moment, I understood that listening was my greatest task. Not to agree with everything, but to acknowledge that in some way we had failed each other. Because when pain goes unspoken, it finds other ways to exact revenge. And perhaps the cruel connection I'd received was just the tip of an iceberg built years ago in silence. As he spoke of past hurts, I sensed something beyond the words. Behind the firm tone and the excuses, there was a hidden loneliness. It was as if all that hardness was a disguise, a form of armor to hide how lost he felt. I knew that weary look. It was the same one I saw in the mirror when I had to face life alone. He said he needed space, that he couldn't handle carrying everything alone anymore. But what he really felt was exhaustion. It wasn't just physical, it was a weight on his soul, as if each decision were a burden greater than he could bear. I understood, in that moment, that my son wasn't just rejecting me. He was also crying out for help, even if he didn't have the courage to admit it. Loneliness has many masks. In his case, it was arrogance. He spoke loudly, as if trying to convince, but his eyes betrayed fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear of facing the fact that, despite being an adult, he still needed to be held. This contrast pained me because, as a mother, I always knew how to read what he wasn't saying. Inside, part of me wanted to run and hug him, tell him he wasn't alone. But another part knew this gesture would be rejected. He had closed himself off into a persona that didn't allow affection, only distance. So I held back, keeping the hug close to my chest, silently praying that one day he would accept it again. I realized his loneliness also stemmed from poor choices. Friends who weren't friends, financial decisions that imprisoned him, relationships that drained him instead of enriching him. All of this left him isolated, surrounded by people, but without true companionship. I saw it clearly. He was afraid to admit weakness because he believed that being strong meant never asking for help. This discovery made me wonder how many people live like this. How many hide their pain behind smiles or harsh words, when in reality they're begging for someone to truly see them. My son was one of them. And the greatest cruelty was that, instead of seeking support, he pushed away the very people who could support him. In that moment, I understood that the rejection wasn't just about him in relation to me, but about him in relation to the world itself. He wasn't just rejecting his mother, he was rejecting every reminder of fragility. It was as if he were saying, if I push away everything that reminds me of what I don't have, maybe I can seem whole. This didn't make his actions any less painful, but it gave them meaning. Behind the coldness lay a broken man, trying to protect himself with rusty weapons. It was sad to see my son like this, armed against me, but unarmed before his own life. I took a deep breath and thought, he may have kicked me out of the house, but he can't kick me out of him. Because, even disguised, his loneliness screamed, and I would always hear it. Deep down, that's what motherhood is, seeing cracks where the world only sees walls. And it was in that moment that I realized my pain and his were different, but they met at the same point: loneliness. I abandoned, he lost. Two lonely people under the same roof, pretending not to need each other. And this truth, cruel as it was, prepared me for what was to come next, the revelation of the true weight he carried. It was after a long sigh that he finally blurted out the truth. It wasn't just about space, nor about moving. He confessed, his eyes downcast. "Mom, I'm in debt. I didn't know what else to do." Those words fell on me like stones. Suddenly, all the pieces began to fall into place, and what had seemed like coldness revealed itself to be desperation. He explained that he had made bad deals, trusted undeserving people, and gotten himself into debt beyond his means. The rented room, the donated furniture, all of this was part of a desperate attempt to survive. It wasn't just a choice against me, it was an act of desperation against life itself. I listened in silence, but a whirlwind was building inside me. The pain of rejection was still raw, but now it was accompanied by another pain, that of seeing my son defeated, ashamed, trapped in mistakes that could have been avoided. The burden he carried wasn't just financial, it was also moral. He said he didn't want to tell me before, so I wouldn't worry. But by hiding it, he hurt me even more. Because instead of asking for help, you pushed me away. That was the cruelest wound, realizing that, for him, I was no longer a safe haven, but an extra burden. I, who had always been a shelter, was now seen as a threat of more responsibility. Tears welled in his eyes, but he held them in check. He swallowed them like someone swallowing stones. I recognized that gesture. It was the same one I used to make when I needed to be strong in front of him, even though I was broken inside. There, before me, was a reflection of what I myself had once been, someone who suffered in silence. Despite the pain, I felt compassion, because I understood that the man who drove me away was also the frightened boy I once cradled. He couldn't handle the weight of failure and chose the worst path, pushing away love to avoid exposing his weakness. But a mother's love doesn't work that way. It doesn't fade in the face of failure. It multiplies. I thought about how many times I'd hidden my own problems so as not to worry him. How many nights I'd cried alone, believing I was protecting him by carrying everything on my shoulders. Now he was the one repeating this cycle, and I realized that, unintentionally, I'd taught him to hide his pain instead of sharing it. This revelation didn't erase the cruelty of the connection, nor did it restore what was lost. But it helped me understand. And understanding, even without justifying it, brought a strange relief. Because when we discover the root of a wound, we can stop picking at it and start thinking about how to heal it. He looked up for a moment and asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you hate me for this?" My heart broke. I didn't respond with words, but with a tearful look. Because, despite everything, hating him was never an option. What I felt was pain, yes, but also an immense desire to still be his mother, even in that chaos. And it was at that moment that I realized the rejection I'd suffered stemmed not just from selfishness, but from desperation. The revealed secret revealed not only his error, but also his fear of losing me. Because, deep down, perhaps he thought that by revealing his flaw, I would stop loving him. Little did he know that a mother's love isn't a currency to be lost in debt. It endures, even when everything else fades. That night, I lay on the living room sofa, but sleep was impossible. My body craved rest, but my mind was a whirlwind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face telling me not to come back, and then, right after, the same face confessing the debts, the fear, the despair. How to reconcile these two versions of my son, one cruel, the other fragile. I tossed and turned, listening to the creaking of the house in the early morning silence. The once familiar noise now seemed to mock me, reminding me that this space was no longer mine. With each creak of the wood, I felt as if the walls were expelling me too. It was a home without a lap, a night without a ground. I grabbed the handkerchief I always carry with me. I pressed it against my face, trying to muffle the sound of my rapid breathing. It had absorbed so many of my tears over the years, and now it seemed to be begging for help so it wouldn't get soaked again. It's curious how simple objects become silent confidants of our pain. The clock on the wall ticked away as if each minute were an eternity. 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 5, and there I was without a second of sleep. Time marched on, but inside me, everything was frozen. I was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, grief, compassion, fear of the future, and, amidst it all, a glimmer of hope. I remember the nights when he, as a boy, also had trouble sleeping. I would lull him to sleep with stories, singing softly until sleep finally overcame him. Now, I was the one who needed songs and stories to soothe my soul. But there was no one to rock me to sleep. I was the mother who had always cared, now with no one to care for me. The hours passed slowly, and I began to pray. I didn't ask God to solve my problems, but I asked for the strength to get through them. I asked for serenity so I wouldn't harden my heart, because pain, when it finds no outlet, turns to bitterness. And I didn't want to let the poison of ingratitude transform me into someone I'm not. The sound of his breathing coming from the room reminded me that we were under the same roof, but in different worlds. He slept, or pretended to sleep, while I fought my ghosts. This contrast hurt me even more. How can anyone rest in peace, while the mother they expelled writhes in the living room? I stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that was yet to come. I knew that sleepless night was just a premonition. The next day would bring new conversations, new pain, maybe even new cuts. It was like waiting for a storm without knowing if the roof would hold. And I was alone in this fragile shelter. The night taught me something. Insomnia isn't just a lack of rest. It's an excess of memories. It's when the past refuses to sleep and insists on poking us. I felt this in every second of darkness. It wasn't just the lack of sleep. It was the presence of pain, occupying every space on the couch where I tried to rest. When the first light of morning came through the window, it brought no relief. It only brought the realization that another day was beginning, and I needed the strength to face it. I woke up tired, but still standing, because even without sleep, I knew I couldn't give up. The night didn't give me rest, but it did give me one certainty. There was still more to face. The next morning, I walked through the house as if I were wandering through a museum of memories. Each room called me back, but also pushed me out. I touched the walls as if they were skin, caressed the stair railing, ran my hand along the door frames. Everything seemed to silently bid me farewell. In the empty room, I sat on the floor for the last time. I looked around and tried to capture every detail in my mind, even though there was nothing there but bare walls. Tears came softly, not of anger, but of recognition. It was time to accept that this space was no longer mine. Letting go of the pain was the only way to release it. I went to the kitchen and leaned against the stove. How many times had I prepared meals there, hurriedly or lovingly, depending on the day? I could still hear the sizzle of garlic in the pan and the pop of the pressure cooker. But I knew that sound now existed only within me. My heart filled with longing, but also with gratitude. In the backyard, I stopped before the soil where I had once planted flowers. I sank my fingers into the ground and felt its rough, cold texture. This earth had already received my seeds, my sweat, my tears. Now I received my farewell. I bowed my head and murmured, "Thank you for giving me roots." Every step I took through the house was accompanied by memories. The living room of the improvised parties, the hallway of my son's first steps, the window where I so often peered out at the world, hoping for better news. All of this would remain there, as part of the house's history, even if I could no longer inhabit it. I looked at the gate once more, the same one that had welcomed me as a stranger the day before. Now it would be the final exit. I silently thanked it, not for what it represented today, but for what it had already preserved from us. Because, despite everything, that gate had witnessed years of happy arrivals. Before leaving, I looked at my son. There was no speech, no shared tears. Just a long, heavy look, full of things unsaid. I wanted to believe that, behind that coldness, there was still a hint of recognition. But if there was, he didn't let it show. So I accepted silence as an answer. With my bag over my shoulder and my heart heavy, I crossed the yard. The sound of my footsteps echoed like a farewell. I knew I wouldn't be returning, at least not like before. This wasn't my home anymore. It was just a house, and houses can be left behind. I stopped on the sidewalk, took a deep breath, and felt the cool air on my face. It was as if the world was telling me, life goes on, even without this address. I needed to believe it. I needed to trust that there was a new path, even if I didn't know where it would lead. And then, with discreet tears in my eyes, I kept walking. Each step away from home was also a step toward my freedom. It hurt, yes, but there was also a spark of relief. I was finally accepting that, to stay alive, I needed to say goodbye to what was left behind. As I walked down the street, leaving the house behind, I felt something inside me break. But along with the pain came an unexpected clarity. I understood that, however cruel it had been, that experience hadn't erased who I was. A home can be lost, objects can be donated, but the essence of the life I'd built remains within me. I learned that love is not guaranteed in return. We can offer everything and still receive rejection. This doesn't mean we love wrongly. It just means the other person chose not to acknowledge it. This was one of the most bitter lessons, but also one of the most liberating, because it taught me that my worth doesn't depend on anyone's acceptance, not even my own son's. As I thought about this, I remembered other women I'd known in my life, friends who had also faced ingratitude from their children. I'd always heard these stories with astonishment, thinking it would never happen to me. Now I was one of them, and I realized that old age brings not only wrinkles, but also truths that only reveal themselves when illusions are no longer there. The final lesson that stuck with me is that we can't live trapped in what has already happened. The past is important, but it can't be a prison. I had to learn to let go, even through the pain. Leaving home wasn't just a loss. It was also an invitation to discover who I could still be outside of it. I looked at my hands as I walked. They were empty, yet at the same time, full of stories. These hands had carried my son, cooked, sewed, built a home. Now, they carried only a simple bag. But I realized they still had strength, and that gave me hope. I could still start over. I also understood that forgiveness is a daily choice. It's not about forgetting, but about deciding not to be poisoned by resentment. I didn't know if I could forgive my son completely, but I knew I didn't want to spend the rest of my life trapped in hatred. Forgiveness, in the end, would be more for me than for him. As I walked, I felt the world remain the same. Cars passing, children playing, neighbors talking. Life didn't stop for my pain, and that, too, was a lesson. No matter how broken our hearts are, time moves on. And it's up to us to choose whether to stagnate or move with it. Looking at the horizon, I realized that true wealth wasn't in the house, nor the furniture, nor the room that had been ripped from me. It was in the ability to carry on, even after the fall. This was the legacy I wanted to leave myself, the certainty that I could lose everything and still stand. Life, deep down, is made of goodbyes. Some we choose, others are forced upon us. Mine that morning was forced upon us. But I transformed it into a learning experience, because I learned that even in abandonment, there is room for dignity. Even in rejection, there is room for courage. And so, with a heavy heart, but also a deeper awareness, I went on my way. Maybe I'd never have that home again. Maybe my son would never be the same. But I had discovered something greater, that life can tear down walls, but it will never tear away my essence. And that was the final lesson I took with me, the only one no one can take away from me. And this was the story of a mother who discovered, in the most painful way, that the love received is not always the same as the love given. But I want to ask you, if you were in her shoes, how would you react? Would you have the strength to get back up after such a cruel rejection? The truth is that we all carry fragile relationships, and often we only realize this when it's too late. Perhaps today is the time to look at those by your side and appreciate them before time or distance do that for you. And now I leave you with this reflection. Are we taking care of those who have always taken care of us? Or are we, without realizing it, repeating the same ingratitude? If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Here, you'll always find stories that move you, but also awaken you to truths no one has the courage to tell.